The knock on his door sounded smaller than a branch snapping in the wind, but Samuel Peter knew the sound of the forest. He knew the groan of old pines and the skitter of creatures in the undergrowth. This was different. This was a human sound. And up on this ridge, humans only came when they were running from something, or when they were hunting something. He rose from the chair by the fire, his bones aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with age. Rain slid down the single window pane like a greasy tear. The world outside was a wash of grey and misery. The knock came again, softer this time, hesitant, like a ghost asking permission to come in from the cold. Samuel didn't own a gun for show. He kept it loaded by the hearth, but his hand went to the heavy iron poker instead. He was a quiet man, not a fool. He crossed the room, his boots making the floorboards complain, and pulled the heavy door inward just a crack. Cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and decay. And standing in that drizzle, looking more like spirits than children, were 3 little girls. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10. She held the youngest clutched to her chest, a tiny thing wrapped in what looked like a potato sack. The middle one stood beside her, shivering so hard her teeth rattled, her small hand balled into a fist. Their clothes were rags. Their feet were bare and blue against the muddy ground. The oldest one, with eyes far too old for her face, lifted her chin. "Sir," she whispered, her voice a thin thread against the wind. "Our mom is sick. She can't move." She pointed a trembling finger toward the tree line. "Please, can you help us?" Samuel's throat felt tight, like he'd swallowed dust. He looked past them, squinting through the downpour. Near the edge of the woods, he could just make out the shape of a wagon. It wasn't just stopped, it was broken, tilted at a sickening angle, one wheel splintered and half buried in the mud. A canvas flap lifted in the wind, and for a second he saw a figure inside, a woman lying still as death. He hesitated. Every instinct he'd honed over 5 years of solitude screamed at him to shut the door. Trouble had a way of sticking to a man, but the little girl's eyes held him. They weren't just asking for help. They were daring him to be the kind of man who would refuse. He grabbed his coat from the peg. "Stay here," he grunted, the words rusty in his throat. He didn't wait for an answer. He plunged into the rain, his boots sinking into the grasping mud, each step a fight. The closer he got to the wagon, the worse it was. The axle was snapped clean in 2. The supplies they'd been carrying, flour, blankets, a child's wooden doll, were scattered and ruined in the muck. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a catastrophe. Inside, the woman lay on a pile of damp straw. Her face was slick with fever, her hair matted to her forehead. A dirty bandage was wrapped around her wrist, but a dark stain was seeping through it. She was breathing, but just barely. A shallow, rattling sound. When his shadow fell over her, her eyes fluttered open. They were filled with a terror so profound, it made the hair on his arms stand up. "Please," she rasped, her lips cracked and bleeding. "The girls, protect them." He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just gently lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. As he carried her back toward the cabin, he felt a strange prickle on his neck, the feeling of being watched. He scanned the dark tree line, the heavy pines that stood like silent judges. There was nothing, just the rain and the wind. But the feeling didn't go away. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. He laid the woman on his own cot by the fire. The girls huddled together in a corner, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. He cleaned the wound on her wrist. It was a deep, ugly gash, not something from a wagon crash. It was straight, clean, almost like a knife cut. He pushed the thought away. He rebandaged it with clean linen. His hands, usually so clumsy, moving with a strange, forgotten gentleness. The woman, Mary, she'd later tell him her name was, drifted in and out of consciousness. She spoke of Kansas, of a husband lost to consumption, of a cousin in Nevada who was their last hope. The story was simple, plausible. But as the night wore on, Samuel noticed things, small things that didn't fit. She wore a small silver locket around her neck, tucked beneath her dress. It was fine work, too fine for a dirt-poor farmer's widow. And when she shivered in her fevered sleep, she didn't call out for a husband named John or William. She whispered another name, over and over again, like a curse. Cyrus. No. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world cold and clean. Samuel stepped outside to fetch firewood, and his eyes were drawn back to the wrecked wagon. He walked over to it, the broken axle, the splintered wheel. But this time he saw something else, something he'd missed in the rain and the dark. On the forest floor, half hidden by a fern, was a man's glove. It was made of fine black leather, the kind a wealthy man would wear. And lying beside it, glinting in the pale morning light, was a spent brass shell casing. Samuel picked it up. It was from a revolver. He looked from the casing in his hand to the gash on Mary's wrist, to the terror in her eyes he'd seen the night before. This wasn't an accident. This was an attack. The story about Kansas, the dead husband, it was a lie. And whatever truth this woman and her children were running from, it had followed them right to his doorstep. He was no longer just a hermit helping a family in need. He was a man standing in the middle of a hunt. And he had no idea if he was the hunter or the prey. Samuel didn't mention the glove or the shell casing. He acted as if he'd seen nothing. He boiled broth for Mary, split extra firewood, and answered the girl's timid questions with single gruff words. But he was watching. He saw the way Mary flinched every time the wind rattled the door. He saw how the oldest girl, Leah, would stare out the window for hours. Her expression not of a child's boredom, but of a soldier on watch. They weren't just recovering from a journey, they were hiding. One afternoon, while Mary slept and the younger girls napped by the fire, Leah was sweeping the floor with a broken broom. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was unnerving in a child. He nodded to her. "You don't have to do that." She stopped, clutching the broom handle. "Mama says we earn our keep." He saw something in her eyes then, not fear, but a flicker of defiance. "Where are you really from?" he asked, his voice low. She froze, her knuckles went white on the broom. "Kansas," she said, but the word was brittle, hollow. "Your mama's locket," he pressed, keeping his tone even. "It's fine silver, not something a farmer's wife would own." Leah's eyes darted toward her mother, then back to him. She took a tiny step back. "My father, he was a good provider." He knew he was scaring her, but he had to know. "What was his name?" he asked. The girl swallowed hard. Her lips formed a word, but no sound came out. She just shook her head, a silent, desperate plea for him to stop. He let it go, but now he was certain. They were trapped in a lie so dangerous that even a child knew not to speak the truth. A few days later, he had to go into Iron Creek for supplies. It was a place he avoided, a town full of whispers and long memories. The folks there remembered him as the man who went wild with grief after his sweetheart Clara died. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know he hadn't just lost her to a fever, but to something much darker that had left him a hollowed-out shell of a man. As he loaded sacks of flour onto his mule, he heard his name. It was Mrs. Dutton, the general store owner and the town's chief gossip. "Samuel Peter," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Heard you got company up on that ridge." He just grunted, not looking at her, but she wasn't done. "A man was in here yesterday, a stranger, dressed mighty fine for these parts, asking questions." Samuel stopped what he was doing. He turned slowly to face her. "What kind of questions?" Mrs. Dutton preened, enjoying the attention. "He was asking if anyone had seen a woman, a widow with 3 little girls, said he was a family friend. Worried about them on the road." A cold dread washed over Samuel. It wasn't a family friend. He knew it in his bones. It was them, the hunters. What did this man look like?
he asked, his voice tight. Tall, she said, wore a fine leather glove on his left hand, had a scar right here. She drew a line across her cheek with a bony finger. The description sent a chill straight through him. The glove. It had to be the owner of the glove he'd found by the wagon. They weren't just coming, they were already here. He paid for his supplies and left without another word, his mind racing. He had to warn Mary. He had to know the truth, the whole truth, before that man with the scar found his way up the mountain. As he urged his mule up the winding path, he felt that same prickling sensation on his neck. The feeling of being watched. He stopped, scanning the dense woods around him. The forest was silent, too silent, not even a bird call. Then he saw it. A glint of metal high up on the ridge overlooking the path. A rifle scope. Someone was up there watching his cabin. Waiting. His blood ran cold. He wasn't just walking back to his home. He was walking into a trap, and he was leading the hunters right to their prey.
Samuel didn't go straight back to the cabin. He tethered the mule in a thicket of birch trees, well off the main path. He moved through the woods with a silence he'd learned from years of hunting deer, his feet barely disturbing the fallen leaves. He circled around, coming up on his own property from behind, using the rocky outcrops for cover. He had to see who was watching him. From a ridge opposite his cabin, he lay flat on the cold ground, peering through a thicket of pine branches. Down below, he saw his cabin, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. It took him 10 minutes of scanning the opposite hillside before he found him. A man, dressed in dark clothes, half hidden behind a large boulder. He had a long rifle resting on the rock, pointed directly at Samuel's front door. He was patient, a professional. This was no mere family friend. This was an assassin. Samuel's mind reeled. Who was Mary Collins? Who was this Cyrus she whispered about in her sleep? And why did he want her and her children dead? He knew he couldn't confront the man directly. A rifle from that distance was a death sentence. He had to get back to the cabin, get Mary and the girls, and disappear into the mountains before nightfall. He backed away slowly, carefully, every nerve screaming. He made it back to the mule, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to get them out, now. When he burst through the cabin door, Mary jumped, letting out a small cry. Lyra, who had been standing by the window, spun around, her face pale. "What is it?" Mary asked, her hand going to her throat. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, pack what you can carry." "Go where?" she stammered. "What's happened?" "There's a man on the ridge," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "With a rifle. He's watching the cabin." The color drained from her face. She looked like she was going to collapse. All the strength, all the fierce pride he'd seen in her, crumbled away, replaced by pure, naked terror. "He found us," she whispered. The name escaped her lips like a ghost. Cyrus found us. It was no longer a question. It was a confession. "Who is Cyrus?" Samuel demanded, grabbing a canvas sack and stuffing it with dried meat and hardtack. "He's my husband," she choked out, tears finally streaming down her face. "He's not dead." The story came tumbling out then, a torrent of fear and desperation. Mary wasn't from Kansas. She was from St. Louis. Her husband, Cyrus Blackwood, wasn't a farmer. He was a powerful, wealthy man who ran the city's shipping trade. And he wasn't just a businessman. He was a monster. He dealt in things that lived in the shadows: smuggling, extortion, violence. To the world, he was a pillar of the community. In private, he was a tyrant who ruled his home with an iron fist. The gash on her wrist wasn't from a wagon crash. It was from him, a punishment for defying him one last time. She hadn't been traveling to a cousin in Nevada. She had been running for her life, trying to get to California, to disappear completely. "He told me," she sobbed, her body shaking. that if I ever tried to leave, he would hunt me to the ends of the earth. He said he would take my girls and that I would never see them again." Samuel listened, his face a mask of stone, but inside a cold fury was building. It was a familiar fury, an old ghost he thought he'd buried 5 years ago. He remembered another powerful man, a banker's son who had too much money and no soul. He remembered how that man had cornered his Clara at a town dance, how she had refused him, and how, a week later, she'd been found at the bottom of a ravine. Her death ruled an accident. Samuel had known it wasn't an accident. He'd gone to the sheriff, but the banker's son had an alibi, and the sheriff had advised Samuel to let it go. There was no evidence, he'd said, just the word of a grieving man against a wealthy family. Samuel hadn't let it go. He had lost his mind. He'd nearly beaten the man to death with his bare hands, and had only been stopped when the sheriff pulled a gun on him. After that, he'd retreated to the mountains, the town's whispers of crazy and broken following him like a curse. He had chosen silence because justice had failed him. Now, looking at Mary's terrified face, at her 3 small daughters, he saw it all happening again. Another powerful man, another woman trying to escape, another system that would surely fail them. The watcher on the ridge wasn't just a threat to Mary. He was a ghost from Samuel's own past, come back to mock him. "He won't take them," Samuel said, the words coming out like chips of granite. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. He looked at Leah, the oldest girl. She hadn't cried. She stood straight and tall, her small face set, with a grim determination that broke his heart. "Leah," he said softly.
"The day of the accident. Did you see who did it?" The girl nodded, her dark eyes meeting his. "There were 2 of them," she said, her voice steady, chillingly adult. "One had a scar on his face. They broke the wagon. They hurt Mama. They said Mr. Blackwood sent his regards." So it was true. All of it. The hunt was real, and the hunter was already at their door. "We can't use the path," Samuel said, thinking fast. "They'll be watching it. There's an old mining tunnel on the north side of this mountain. It comes out in the next valley. It's dangerous, but it's our only chance." As they gathered their meager belongings, Samuel glanced at the silver locket still around Mary's neck. "Why do you still wear that?" he asked. She clutched it protectively. "It was my mother's," she whispered. "It's all I have left of her." He nodded, but something about her grip, the desperation in her eyes, told him there was more to it. Another secret she was still holding back. But there was no time for questions. They slipped out the back of the cabin as dusk began to settle, melting into the deep shadows of the pines. Samuel led the way, moving with an eerie silence, the woman and her 3 children following like phantoms in his wake. He carried the youngest, while Mary and Leah helped the middle girl over the rough terrain. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. He knew the man on the ridge would soon realize they were gone. He would come down to the cabin, and when he found it empty, the real hunt would begin. They were no longer hiding. They were prey, and the wolves were closing in. The mining tunnel was a black moor in the side of the mountain, smelling of damp earth and decay. Old timbers, slick with moisture, framed the entrance. "Stay close," Samuel warned, lighting a small lantern. The light flickered, casting huge dancing shadows against the rock walls. The air inside was cold and thin, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the oppressive darkness. The girls huddled close to Mary, their small faces pale in the lantern light. The youngest started to whimper. "Shh, sweet girl," Mary whispered, her own voice trembling. "It's an adventure." But her eyes met Samuel's over the child's head, and he saw the raw fear in them. This was no adventure. This was a tomb. They moved deeper into the earth's guts. The tunnel was treacherous, littered with loose rocks and sudden drops. More than once, Samuel had to hold the lantern high to navigate a section where the roof had partially collapsed. He could feel the weight of the entire mountain pressing down on them. Hours bled into one another. They were all exhausted, their legs aching, their hope dwindling with the oil in the lantern. It was then that the middle girl, Sarah, stumbled, her small foot catching on a rotten railway tie. She fell hard, her cry echoing through the tunnel. Mary rushed to her, but it was too late. Her ankle was twisted, swelling rapidly. She couldn't walk. "I'm sorry, Mama," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry." Mary tried to comfort her, but panic was setting in. They were trapped, miles from either entrance, with a dwindling light and an injured child. Samuel set the lantern down. "I'll carry her," he said, his voice steady. He gently lifted the crying girl. She was light, but his own strength was starting to fade. They pressed on, their pace now agonizingly slow. The lantern began to gutter, its flame shrinking to a tiny blue speck. And then it went out, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. A collective gasp of terror filled the tunnel. "Don't move," Samuel ordered, his voice sharp. He fumbled in his pack for another match, his fingers clumsy with cold and urgency. He struck it against the rock wall. It flared, then died. He tried another. Nothing. His matches were damp. The darkness pressed in, a physical weight. It was no longer just the absence of light, it was a living thing, filled with the sound of their own panicked breathing and the steady, maddening drip, drip, drip of water. It was in that moment of complete despair that he heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from up ahead. It wasn't the sound of falling rock, it was methodical, deliberate. Someone else was in the tunnel with them. Samuel's blood ran cold. Had Cyrus's men known about this tunnel? Had they somehow gotten ahead of them? He put Sarah down gently, pulling the heavy hunting knife from his belt. "Mary," he whispered, his voice barely a breath, "get the girls behind me, now." The scraping grew louder, closer. It was followed by a low groan. It wasn't the sound of a hunter, it was the sound of someone in pain. Samuel moved forward slowly, his hand outstretched, feeling his way along the cold, wet wall of the tunnel. He was a blind man, moving toward a sound that could be death. His hand touched something, not rock.
Fabric, coarse and wet. He followed it up and felt a shoulder, then a face, rough with stubble. A man was slumped against the wall. Samuel fumbled for the man's wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint, but steady. Who was he? What was he doing here? As his eyes slowly adjusted to the profound blackness, he started to make out a faint, almost imperceptible glow coming from farther down the tunnel. Hope surged through him. It was a way out. "There's light ahead," he whispered back to Mary. "And there's a man here. He's alive." Leaving the stranger for now, he led them toward the light. It grew brighter with every step, a pale, silvery luminescence that seemed almost holy after the suffocating dark. It was the moon. They had reached the other side. They stumbled out of the tunnel into a small, hidden valley, surrounded by towering peaks. The moonlight bathed everything in a ghostly glow. They were safe, for now. "We have to go back for him," Mary said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and concern. Samuel nodded. "You stay here with the girls. Hide in those rocks. I'll be back." He went back into the tunnel, his steps more confident now that he knew the way. He reached the unconscious man and, with a grunt of effort, hauled him over his shoulder. The man was heavy, but adrenaline fueled Samuel's strength. He carried him out into the moonlight and laid him on the ground. As Mary brought a damp cloth to wipe the man's face, Samuel saw it. A glint of metal pinned to the inside of the man's jacket. It was a sheriff's badge. But it wasn't from Iron Creek. The lettering read, Elkhorn County. What was a sheriff from another county doing, injured and unconscious, in an abandoned mine? The sheriff, whose name was Elias Thorne, woke an hour later. He was weak, his head bleeding from a nasty gash, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He explained he'd been tracking a pair of men wanted for robbery in his county. He'd followed their trail up into these mountains, but they'd gotten the drop on him, hit him from behind, and left him for dead in the tunnel. "Two men?" Samuel asked, his voice tense. "Did one of them have a scar on his cheek?" Thorne's eyes narrowed. "That's them. The Miller brothers. Hired guns, nasty as they come. I heard they'd taken a job for some rich man out of St. Louis, a man named Blackwood. The name hit the small valley like a thunderclap. It all clicked into place. The men watching the cabin weren't just watching. They were the same men who had attacked the wagon. The same men who had left this sheriff for dead. Cyrus Blackwood hadn't just hired one man. He'd sent a team. Sheriff Thorne tried to stand, but grimaced in pain. His leg was broken. He was in no shape to fight, or even to travel. "You have to get out of here," Thorne said, his voice urgent. "They know this area. If they know you're with him," he nodded toward Samuel, "they'll assume you're helping me. They'll kill you all without a second thought." They were caught between a rock and a hard place. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't go back. And they couldn't leave a wounded lawman to die. While they debated what to do, Leah, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. "Mama's locket," she said, her voice small but clear. All eyes turned to her. "What about it, honey?" Mary asked. "Show him," Leah insisted, looking at Samuel. "Show him what's inside." Mary hesitated, her hand going instinctively to the silver locket. She looked at Samuel, then at the wounded sheriff, her eyes filled with a desperate, cornered fear. Finally, with trembling fingers, she unclasped it. "It wasn't my mother's," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. She opened the small silver heart, but it wasn't a portrait of a loved one inside. It was a key, a tiny, intricately made key. "Cyrus has a safe in his office," Mary explained, her words rushing out. "It's hidden behind a portrait of his father. It's where he keeps his real ledgers. Not the ones he shows his partners, but the ones that detail everything. The smuggling, the bribes to politicians, the names of the men he's paid to make his rivals disappear. This key is the only way to open it." Samuel stared at the key, then at Mary. "So this isn't just about you leaving him. He's not afraid you'll talk. He's afraid you have the proof." "He thinks I took the ledgers," she said, shaking her head. "But I couldn't. I only had time to grab the key. I thought if I had it, it would be leverage, a way to make him leave us alone." Sheriff Thorne let out a low whistle. "Mary, that key doesn't just make him want to find you. It makes him need to bury you. If those ledgers get out, his entire empire crumbles. He'll be hanged." The stakes had just been raised to an impossible height. This was no longer a domestic dispute. This was a war against a kingpin who had everything to lose and would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. They were no longer just running for their lives. They were carrying the weapon that could destroy a man like Cyrus Blackwood. And that made them the most dangerous people in the world to him. "The Millers will be searching this whole area," Thorne said, his mind working despite the pain. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles east of here, in a box canyon. It's hard to find if you don't know the trail. It's your best chance." "We can't leave you," Samuel said. "You won't," Thorne replied, a grim smile on his face. "You're going to help me get there. We're all in this together now." The journey to the trapper's cabin was a special kind of hell. Samuel and Mary fashioned a crude stretcher for Sheriff Thorne out of 2 saplings and a blanket. They took turns carrying him, while Leah helped Sarah, whose ankle was still badly swollen. They moved under the cover of darkness, resting during the day in caves and thickets, terrified that every sound was the Miller brothers closing in. During one of their hushed, fireless nights, Samuel found himself sitting watch next to Mary. The children were asleep, huddled together for warmth. The wounded sheriff was drifting in and out of a fevered sleep. "You should have told me," Samuel said, his voice low, not accusatory, just tired. "From the beginning." "You would have turned us away," she whispered, staring into the darkness. "And you would have been right to. I've brought nothing but death to your door." He was silent for a long time. The wind sighed through the pines above them. "My door was empty," he finally said. "Death was already living inside. At least now there's a reason to fight it." Her eyes glistened in the faint starlight. She reached out, and her hand briefly touched his, a small, fleeting gesture of gratitude that felt more intimate than a kiss. It was in that moment he realized his solitude hadn't been peace. It had been a slow surrender. And this woman, this family, this impossible situation, it had woken him up. He was no longer the ghost of the mountain. He was a man with something to protect. They found the cabin at dawn on the third day. It was little more than a one-room shack, tucked away in a narrow canyon where the walls rose up on three sides like a fortress. It was defensible. Samuel immediately set to work reinforcing the door and shuttering the single window. Mary tended to Thorne's leg, which was getting worse, the skin around the break an angry red. The girls, exhausted but resilient, gathered firewood and fresh water from a small stream that ran through the canyon. For a short time, there was a sense of fragile peace, but they all knew it was temporary. The Miller brothers were out there, and they were good. They would find this place, eventually. "They'll come," Thorne said that evening, his voice raspy with fever. "And they won't come expecting a fair fight. They'll likely try to burn you out." Samuel nodded, his jaw tight. He checked his rifle, his small supply of ammunition. It wasn't enough, not for a siege. He looked around the cabin, at the small, terrified family he had somehow adopted. He had one rifle, a hunting knife, and the unforgiving terrain of the mountains he knew better than his own soul. It would have to be enough. That night, as a storm rolled in, cloaking the canyon in thunder and rain, he saw it. A flicker of light on the canyon rim, high above them. A lantern. Just for a second. Then it was gone. They had been found. The attack didn't come with a shout. It came with a whisper, the whisper of an arrow thudding into the wooden shutter of the window. Samuel saw it quiver, a piece of oil-soaked rag tied just below the arrowhead. It wasn't lit. It was a message, a promise. "They're playing with us," Thorne rasped from his cot, "trying to spook you, make you run." "I don't run," Samuel said, his eyes fixed on the shutter. He moved Mary and the girls to the back of the cabin, behind a pile of old firewood. "Stay down," he commanded. "No matter what you hear." Another arrow hit the door, and another, still unlit. They were testing the defenses, seeing how he would react. Samuel did nothing. He stood in the shadows, his rifle ready, his breathing slow and steady. He was back in his element now. The hunt had come to his home turf. Let them come. Hours passed. The rain stopped. The moon came out from behind the clouds, bathing the canyon in an eerie light. The silence stretched, becoming more terrifying than any noise. Then came a new sound. A soft, scraping noise against the back wall of the cabin. A wall with no windows, no doors. A solid wall of logs. They weren't trying to come in. They were trying to tear it down. Samuel knew the cabin's weak point was the chimney, made of loose rock and clay. He gestured for Mary to stay quiet and crept toward the hearth. He put his ear to the cold stone. He could hear them, two distinct voices whispering just outside. "Just a few more rocks," one said. "Then we drop the oil in and light it up. Cook 'em out." They weren't going to tear the wall down. They were going to pour oil down the chimney and turn the entire cabin into an inferno. It was a devilishly smart plan. There would be no escape. Samuel's mind raced. He couldn't shoot through the chimney. He couldn't get out the door or window. He was trapped. He looked at Mary, at the faces of her sleeping children, their chests rising and falling in the firelight. He thought of Clara. He thought of the justice he'd been denied. Not again. He would not fail again.
He looked at the heavy iron kettle sitting by the fire, filled with water for the morning. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his mind. He stoked the fire, adding log after log, making it roar. The cabin grew sweltering hot. "What are you doing?" Mary whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "Trust me," he said, his voice grim. He placed the kettle directly in the heart of the raging fire. The water inside began to hiss, then bubble, then boil with a furious energy. He waited, listening to the scraping outside. The sound stopped. He could hear them positioning themselves, getting ready. It was now or never. With a thick leather glove, he grabbed the handle of the kettle. It was almost too hot to hold. "Stay back," he yelled. And with a roar of his own, he swung the kettle up and hurled its entire contents, gallons of boiling water, straight up the chimney. A scream of agony from outside tore through the night. It was followed by a string of curses and the sound of a body hitting the ground. One of them was down, badly scalded. The other brother, the one with the scar, let out a bellow of rage. "You'll pay for that, mountain man!" Gunshots erupted, splintering the wood of the door and the shutter. They weren't trying to be clever anymore. This was pure fury. Samuel knew he'd only bought himself a few moments. The enraged brother would be reckless now. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. "He'll come through the front," Thorne coughed from his bed. "He's angry. He won't be thinking straight." Samuel nodded. He peered through a tiny crack in the door. He could see him. Scarface. He was using a large boulder for cover, reloading his pistol. The other brother was writhing on the ground nearby, out of the fight. It was one-on-one. Samuel took a deep breath, aimed his rifle, and waited. Scarface darted from behind the boulder, sprinting toward the cabin, his pistol raised. Samuel fired. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The running man stumbled, clutching his leg, and fell to the ground, his pistol skittering across the rocks. Samuel didn't hesitate. He threw open the door and was on the man in seconds. The cold steel of his hunting knife pressed against the man's throat. "Where is Blackwood?" Samuel demanded. The man just spat at him, his eyes filled with hate. "He's coming," he snarled, "and when he gets here, he'll peel the skin from you and your whole damn family." Samuel tied the two brothers up, using their own ropes. The one he'd shot was bleeding badly, and the other was in agony from the burns. They weren't going anywhere, but the warning chilled him to the bone. Cyrus Blackwood was coming, not his men. The man himself. He knew then that this wouldn't end in the mountains. He couldn't hide forever. He had to stop this, once and for all. He looked at the key, which Mary had placed on the small wooden table. It was a key to a safe 1,000 miles away. It was useless, or was it? An idea began to form in his head, a wild, desperate gamble. "Sheriff," he said, turning to Thorne, "how much is Cyrus Blackwood worth?" Thorne looked at him, confused. "Millions, I suppose." "Why?" "Because men with millions have enemies," Samuel said, a strange light in his eyes. "And sometimes all you have to do is let them know where to find the treasure." He spent the next hour with the less injured Miller brother. He didn't use violence. He didn't have to. He used fear. He described in quiet, chilling detail all the ways a man could get lost in these mountains. By the end of it, the man was pale and shaking, ready to tell him anything. Samuel learned everything he needed to know. He learned about Blackwood's rival, a man named Marcus Thorne, no relation to the sheriff, who ran the river trade and hated Blackwood with a passion. He learned where Blackwood was staying, a fancy hotel in the nearest city, 2 days' ride away. And he learned that Blackwood was on his way, coming to handle the situation personally. He formulated his plan. It was insane. It would probably get him killed. But it was the only play he had left. He was going to use Blackwood's own greed and paranoia against him. He wrote 2 letters. The first was to Marcus Thorne, Blackwood's rival. It was short and to the point. It said that for a price he could deliver the key to Cyrus Blackwood's downfall. It named a time and a place for a meeting, a remote crossroads, 3 days from now. He gave this letter to the burned Miller brother. "You ride to St. Louis," Samuel ordered. "You give this to Marcus Thorne and no one else. If you do, I'll let your brother live. If you don't—" He let the threat hang in the air. The man, terrified and in pain, agreed. The second letter was for Cyrus Blackwood. This one was different. It was written as if from the Miller brothers. It said that they had the woman and the key, but that they were tired of his low pay. They were selling it to the highest bidder, Marcus Thorne. It detailed the same time and place for the meeting. He gave this letter to the shot Miller brother. "You're going to get on your horse," Samuel instructed, "and you're going to ride until you meet your boss on the trail. You give him this. You tell him your brother has turned on you both." He was setting a trap. He was pitting two powerful, violent men against each other, with himself and Mary's key as the bait. He was hoping they would destroy each other. As the two wounded men rode off in opposite directions, Mary looked at him, her face a mixture of terror and awe. "This is madness," she whispered. "He'll kill you." "He's already tried," Samuel said, his voice flat. He looked toward the distant peaks, golden in the morning sun. It's time someone hunted him for a change. The next 2 days were the longest of Samuel's life. He left Mary, the girls, and the still recovering Sheriff Thorne hidden in a secret cave he knew, high up in the mountains, with enough food and water for a week. "Don't come out," he told them, "no matter what." He rode to the crossroads alone. It was a desolate spot where two dirt tracks met in the middle of a barren plain. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. It was the perfect stage for a final act. He arrived a day early, not to the crossroads itself, but to the rocky hills that overlooked it. He spent hours studying the terrain, planning every detail, every angle, every escape route. He wasn't a gunman or a brawler. He was a hunter. And the wilderness was his weapon. He knew Blackwood wouldn't come alone. And he suspected Marcus Thorne wouldn't either. He was walking into a war. On the third day, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they started to arrive. First came Marcus Thorne's men, 4 of them, riding hard, their rifles held ready. They took up positions in the rocks, surrounding the crossroads. An hour later, Cyrus Blackwood arrived. He rode a magnificent black horse, and he was flanked by 6 men, all of them looking like they were carved from the same piece of granite as the mountains. Blackwood was exactly as Samuel had pictured him. Tall, dressed in a fine black coat, his face handsome, but marred by an arrogance that twisted it into something cruel. They took up positions opposite Thorne's men. The crossroads became a no-man's land between 2 small armies. The air crackled with tension. Samuel watched from his hiding spot a half-mile away, his heart pounding. The trap was set. Now he just had to spring it. He waited until the sun was a fiery red slit on the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows. Then he rode out from a hidden ravine, leading a second horse behind him. Mary's horse, with a figure bundled in blankets tied to the saddle, making it look like he had a captive. He rode slowly, deliberately, into the center of the crossroads, placing himself directly between the 2 armed camps. He stopped, holding up the silver locket so it caught the last rays of sunlight. "I have what you both came for," he shouted, his voice carrying in the still evening air. Cyrus Blackwood spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of fury. "Where is she? Where is my wife?" "She's safe," Samuel called back, "but this key is for sale, to the highest bidder." Marcus Thorne, a thick, powerfully built man, also rode forward. "I'll pay you double whatever he's offering," Thorne boomed, his eyes gleaming with greed and hatred for his rival. "First the proof," Blackwood sneered. "Show me the key." Samuel held it up again. "Come and get it." That was the signal. It was all the spark the powder keg needed. "He's mine," Blackwood roared at his men, drawing his pistol. "Kill them all." Thorne's men opened fire at the same instant. The crossroads erupted into a whirlwind of gunfire and chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted, and bullets whizzed through the air. It was exactly what Samuel had counted on. In the confusion, he slipped off his horse, cut the bundle from the decoy horse, and crawled into a shallow ditch he had picked out beforehand. The 2 groups, blinded by their greed and hatred for each other, were tearing each other apart, just as he'd planned. The gunfight was brutal and short. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay scattered across the dirt. Both Cyrus Blackwood and Marcus Thorne were among the dead, cut down in the crossfire they had started. A few men from both sides were wounded, but most had fled when their leaders fell. Samuel waited until the silence was absolute before he emerged. He walked through the carnage, his face grim. He found Blackwood's body. The man's eyes were open, staring at the sky with a look of shocked disbelief. Even in death, he looked arrogant. Samuel reached down and closed the man's eyes. It was over. The monster was dead. The hunt was finally, truly over. He retrieved the locket, the small key that had caused so much death still nestled inside. He thought about throwing it away, but he didn't. It was a part of their story now. He rode back to the mountains under a sky full of stars, a free man. When he reached the cave, Mary was waiting for him at the entrance. She must have heard his horse. When she saw he was alone and unharmed, she ran to him, throwing her arms around him, tears of relief streaming down her face. "It's done," he said softly, holding her close. "It's all done." They returned to the cabin on the ridge, the place where it had all begun. Sheriff Thorne was healing, and a few weeks later, he was well enough to ride back to his own county, promising that the official record would show the Miller brothers and Cyrus Blackwood had all been killed while resisting arrest by him. He was giving them a clean slate, a new beginning. Life fell into a new rhythm. The silence of the cabin was replaced by the laughter of children. Samuel taught the girls how to track animals and read the stars. Mary planted a small garden and filled the cabin with the smell of baking bread. The house that had once been a tomb for a broken man was slowly, surely becoming a home. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mary took his calloused hand in hers. "You saved us," she said, her voice filled with a quiet emotion that ran deeper than simple gratitude. "No," he said, looking at her, at the firelight dancing in her eyes. "You saved me." He knew then that he would never go back to the silence. He had found a new language, one spoken not with words, but with shared glances, with mended fences, with the simple, profound act of building a life together against the cold. The mountain man had finally come home. Folks in those hills still talk about the quiet man on the ridge and the widow who appeared out of a storm. They say he tamed the mountain, but the truth is she tamed him. They built a life out of the wreckage of their pasts, proving that sometimes the most broken things can be put back together to make something even stronger. They faced down a monster and won, not with guns or with armies, but with courage and a stubborn refusal to give up. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, a single flame of hope can be enough to light the way home. If you were inspired by Samuel's courage and believe in the power of a second chance, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other strange and wonderful stories are waiting just up the trail.